and welcome to today's AOP live webinar. First of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Philip Ideson. I'm the Managing Director here at Art of Procurement. And first and foremost, I'd like to welcome you to my partner at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. Kelly, thanks for joining and for helping me facilitate today's conversation.
No problem, Phil. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so if you've not been to an AOP Live before, it's all interview and conversation based. You'll actually see a chat box at the side of your screen. So please feel free, let us know where you're dialing in from. If you have any questions or comments, Kelly and I are going to be keeping our eye on that box all the way through the conversation. There's also a Q&A tab as well. You can always put questions in that Q&A tab on the sidebar there, but we're going to keep an eye on both of those. So the more comments, questions, anything like that you can pose, the better, because then we can bring those across to our guest today. Now, our topic today is, we called it a deliberate path to success through comprehensive talent management. So there's multiple models for managing external talent, and procurement's role in evaluating and implementing those. We're really taking a greater role in this space. And this is a space where it's been a long time, but I had some direct experience as well. So I'm really interested in talking a little bit more to our guests around total talent management. Now, we're going to talk about learnings as well from a specific financial services company that grew their successful contingent workforce program into full services procurement. So before we start, I'm just going to introduce the two guests who will be joining us today. We'll be joined by Brian Salkowski, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Guidant Global, and Marie Franz, who's SVP of Client Relationships and Procurement Specialist, also at Guidant Global. So with that being said, let's bring Brian and Marie on stage. Here we go. So Marie, thank you so much for joining us, and Brian as well. We got all the past our technical hurdle. We see you and hear you. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Looking forward to the conversation.
Now, we always start with a question around procurement and procurement background, because a lot of our guests on AOP Live come from a procurement background, but I know that both of you have also come from a services procurement background. So I'm really going to start, and Marie, I'll ask this question to you first, is did you find procurement or did procurement find you? And then why services part of procurement?
I would say procurement found me. So I commenced my career managing contingent labor in the MSP world, and was lured into working with an organization where I was responsible for managing their contingent program, as well as developing their procurement operations. So through that process, I definitely learned a lot around how procurement organizations function, how they interact with the business to develop relationships with third-party vendors, but also some of the obstacles that are faced, especially when it comes to labor. And so it helped me tremendously when I was better positioned to have conversations around how do you stand up a services program regarding external labor. So definitely learned a lot around procedures, difficulties with execution of contracts, as well as ensuring that vendor risk assessments are completed, and how that all folds into developing a tight program filled with compliance, as well as flexibility and protections for the customer.
Well, we're definitely tapping into that experience today, Marie. I think you're a perfect kind of blend of that practitioner experience, but also on the provider side as well, which, at least it really gives you that 360 perspective. So we'll definitely be, let's say, tapping into that. Now, Brian, I wonder if you could just ask the same question of you. How did you find yourself in procurement and services procurement specifically?
Yeah, I'm going to start the same, which is it found me. So I grew up as a solutions service provider, and happened to get connected with a SaaS software as a service company that was automating the procure to pay workflow of services, and needed someone with the provider point of view, understanding the commercials, the dynamics, and motivators. And I made that leap, and as they say, the rest is history. And have been operating for almost 20 years in this space, with a real specific focus on the procurement, engagement, and management of services, and specifically external resources or external talent.
And I see just a very quick logistical question from Helen. Helen's listening on a train in the UK, asking if there will be a recording available. Yes, there will be, and for anybody else as well. We're recording this to share later. So let's go into the first thing that we do in a lot of these webinars is we take a poll of the Art of Procurement community around the topic that we want to talk about today. So let's bring that poll on screen. And the question that we asked is, what is the primary source of complexity procurement must overcome when managing a services procurement or an external talent program? And we have, as always on a LinkedIn poll, we can give 4 answers. I'm going to read this out just in case anybody's listening to this as a podcast later. But the top answer at 53%, so significantly more than any other answer, is the varied stakeholder expectations. And then the other 3 answers actually came in pretty similar. So lack of benchmarking data being an issue, 17%, multiple different fulfillment models around external talent being a challenge for 15%, and then documenting requirement capabilities being 15%. Brian, I'm going to come to you first. Just as you reflect on those results, is this what you would have expected to have seen?
Yeah, it's funny. So Marie and I and Kelly in the run up to this looked at those results, and I think we had a laugh amongst ourselves in a good way, because it was an affirmation of exactly what we would have expected to see. And I think the key word in that question is complexity.
Yeah.
It is complex, and this reinforces it. Varied stakeholder expectations. And if you think about services, those purchases sit in every part of the business. So you do have a wide array of stakeholders that are engaging very different types of services, from software and technology to engineering to facilities. And so it is wide, it's varied, and as you would expect, the stakeholder expectations are different and should be different given the nature of service and external resources that they're engaging.
Marie, any other considerations or thoughts as you look at those results as well?
I think that it's not a surprise. I definitely feel like every organization and every business line has a different view on what success looks like whenever you're talking about the services procurement space, right? If we take a look at what's going on within the IT industry right now, organizations have made tremendous investments around buying IT services. And the goal with all of this was to translate that into revenue. And that hasn't happened quickly enough within the industry right now. And so there's a lot of conversations around how do we turn that tide? What do we need to do differently? And if you talk to the business line, it's going to be focused more on let's continue doing what we're doing. Let's push out the products. If you talk to the finance teams, they're going to be saying, how can we pull back on our spend and still achieve our goals, et cetera. And so there's a lot of push and pull that is occurring within the space right now. And so it makes sense that it's very difficult and very complex to pull it all together and get everyone aligned around what does good look like.
Do you find that the ultimate stakeholder, the person who is ultimately accountable for the results that the talent and the services provide, that's really all they care about? They're not really thinking necessarily about some of the expectations or requirements that other stakeholders across the business have?
I think they're starting to. I'm seeing more and more organizations not only talking about the IT needs, but also talking about the business impact and having the dialogue around what does this mean financially for our organization, and how does that feed into a success criteria when we're looking at the supplier relationship on a whole. Are we getting the return on investment? Is the supplier infusing innovation in our organization, or do we have to direct them to achieve the goals? So, I think that it's a journey, but I think that more organizations are having those tough conversations around talent, projects, as well as downstream financial benefits.
Kelly, any thoughts that you had as you saw these results roll in?
Yeah, I actually think this is really funny. And my practitioner background is completely in services procurement. So this is an area that I enjoy getting to come back and talk about. And as Brian was saying, we did all laugh. The thing that strikes me the most is that stakeholder expectations are different than the requirements and the necessary capabilities from the service itself. So when you think about the things that make a service different than sourcing a product, it always comes down to those specs and requirements. And yet stakeholder expectations remain sort of this slightly different, harder to get your hands around category of information that will still be used to decide whether or not the effort was a success. So I think there's that perspective that comes into play with services and business outcomes that you don't necessarily have on the product side of the house.
Now, Brian, I'm going to ask you around, one of the stakeholders is obviously suppliers. Kelly just mentioned suppliers a little bit there. I wonder if you see specific challenges around meeting supplier expectations through services procurement as well.
Well, I think that many suppliers would prefer to be ungoverned and use that opportunity to not only secure business, but the best potential commercial outcomes for themselves. So there's a natural friction when we talk about putting a program in place, a framework and governance around this with suppliers. What I'm constantly amazed at, and maybe I shouldn't be, having done this for a while, is how those perceptions and attitudes change. And the reason I say that, if we think about a services provider, the acquisition of new engagements is a significant amount of their expense. Getting those requirements, understanding the outcomes, as Kelly just described. And so having a governance structure that can identify the right priority providers for the right services, direct that activity to them, actually has a huge benefit for not only the organization, but for those providers as well. So the early stages, it's about change management. It is about engagement. It is about selling the benefits, and why working in cooperation and collaboration can generate a better outcome. Marie and I use the term all the time. It should be a win-win-win scenario. We want to win. We want to win for our customers, and they get great outcomes at a commercially reasonable price, and the suppliers get great opportunities to deliver and grow.
Now, does the I don't want to say culture necessarily, but the objectives of the end user in putting in place a program like that, does that drive your ability to achieve that win-win-win through, or are there things that the client ultimately can do to foster that win-win-win that you see some doing and frankly some others not doing?
Yeah, there's a couple points I would touch on here, and the first is, it goes back to actually the question that you asked Marie earlier about the varied stakeholders and how those expectations may extend beyond just their part of the business, right? The impact here is organizational. It's not just departmental. Yeah. And as a result, good governance is really important. And so when we think about what those extensions are, so the business obviously cares about quality, they care about outcome, they care about on-time delivery, all those things that you would expect. But when we think about the impacts, Marie mentioned innovation, how that can fuel the business. We think about compliance and risk and how that flows into areas like legal. We think about finance and how they're managing and budgeting for these services. If we have good governance with those stakeholders properly represented, that creates a win for the business, but it also gives greater visibility and greater opportunity to those suppliers as well. And then I go back to the comment Kelly made about requirements gathering. Voice of customer is incredibly important, especially in this services area. And so we spend a lot of time with our customers on requirements up front. What's the old adage? Measure twice, cut once, and we use that when we build our strategies and process flows.
Now, I love a good conversation about governance, but I'm going to try and bite my lip a little bit and hold that on for a little bit later in the conversation. But Maria, I did want to just bring you into the conversation as well. We talked about managing expectations. What are some of the things that procurement can do to help manage the expectations of the stakeholders, before, during, and throughout, really, and then after? But I hesitate to say after, because I think there's always a continuous kind of improvement element to it, but throughout really a services procurement project.
I think the key is around communication and being fully transparent around what are the services going to entail and what are the pain points that the organization is trying to solve is so critical in defining who are the right suppliers to handle that service and who's the right match. I think that one thing that I always stress to customers as well as business lines is that, you know, in this state that we're in, where talent is scarce and suppliers have a choice of customers, it is so important that we have partnership from day one. And you need to be fully transparent around what's going on within your organization and create connection. Your supplier base is actually an extension of your workforce and an extension of your organization. And this time it's more critical than ever to remove the old view that we're the big fish, they're the small fish, we're going to control what they do. That mindset is going to lead to disaster for a service project. And so it's really important to be specific around the requirements, be specific around what does success look like, and determine how we can work together. I think one key is that often whenever services are stood up, you're often in discovery mode, right? And you're reliant on the suppliers to give guidance on what are the future iteration, what are the future services that have to take place in phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, et cetera. And so be open-minded around, really what does this journey look like, and recognize that it might not just be one iteration to achieve success, and continue having that dialogue with all the vendors as we go through it.
Yeah, I love that point that, a services provider is really an extension of your own team. I also have worked in projects where I've been managing as a provider, actually, and you see kind of the engagements that you have the most difficulty with are those where your client puts a contract in place and then says, okay, here's the contract, I'm going to manage you to that. And then if there's problems, I'm going to come back and, with the big stick. But really it's that, it's a transactional relationship as opposed to it being a really collaborative relationship. Now, I want to move on to talking about sources of external talent. And as we kind of set this up, I'd like to just ask Brian, if you could just share a little bit about why you were seeing contingent workforce, services procurement, really having more of a focus from the companies that you were working with. Like, what's making this even more of an important topic for procurement today than it has been, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Because I know it's something that we're really talking about a lot more now, and that a lot of procurement leaders that we talk to are focused a lot more in this area than they ever have been before.
Yeah. The obvious answer is because it's a huge area of spend for most large enterprises, right? So when we talk about making impact relative to level of effort, properly directed, properly focused effort here can have a big impact on the organization and or the business. But there's a reason for that. And that's because when we talk about total workforce, the contingent portion, and I use contingent in the broadest possible term. So that means temporary workers, independent contractors and freelancers, service providers who are executing on a statement of work, outsourced services. They already are and continuing to become even more and more a large percentage of the total workforce. Yeah. And that trend has started 20 plus years ago, and it's only continuing. And if we think about all of the uncertainty that's persisted in the market over the last several years and exists today, the need for flexibility in terms of when organizations engage talent, the ability to ramp up, ramp down, or to keep flexibility so they don't go through an endless cycle of hiring, firing, engagement, disengagement. So there's a lot of macro factors that are contributing to this. And the net of it is it's a big category, it's a huge percentage of spend, and it has an impact when properly managed.
Mm-hmm. I think that something that's interesting to me as we go through, when we had the Great Recession, if you will, 2008, 2009, that looked like it was going to be the platform for more flexible staffing models. But what certainly we saw was that while it was in places, organizations were quick to hire back and hire back permanently. So now as kind of technology has evolved in terms of the way that you manage and track and source talent and source services, it's going to be really interesting to see now as we're going through kind of the pains of COVID, those models kind of sticking, if you will, because companies are really looking to build more of a flexible labor model, more of a flexible cost structure. And that's one of the greatest benefits of looking at your talent strategy, I think, is flexibility and optionality versus a lot of fixed costs, which you have from a traditional FTE model.
That's right. You're taking a fixed cost, you're making it a variable cost for the benefit of the business. And there's a reason that we're talking about comprehensive talent here in those various categories. Whereas going back to the Great Recession, a lot of the focus at that point in time was really on what I would consider traditional contingent temporary worker. Yeah. Right now, most of the conversations that we're engaging with, not only our existing customers, but new prospective customers, are looking at all of those categories with a particular focus on statement of work and true services, because that spend is often 2 to 3 times as large as the traditional contingent.
What are some of the things that determines when a company, for example, comes and has made a decision, we need to look into this category in a little bit more detail? Where do they start? Are they coming thinking at it from a contingent worker perspective versus a services worker, or kind of what's the journey that they would typically go through?
Is that to me or Marie?
Marie, I'm going to ask you that question. I see that you took yourself off mute, so that's a perfect joining into the conversation.
The starting point varies from customer to customer. Some are more focused on getting a handle on the spend and making sure that they have transparency into it. Other organizations are very focused around compliance. You think about what's taking place within the temporary space and the origin of MSPs going back a few decades. The reality is we helped organizations make tremendous gains in understanding who are the workers that are coming in to support you? Are they going through your background check process? Where is the work being performed? And are the right data privacy controls in place and things of that nature? When you think about services procurement, although there's contracts in place, there's often not a team within the organization that's making sure that after the relationship is established, that those same controls are in place on an ongoing basis. And so for a lot of organizations, they're saying, how do I take lessons learned and the benefits that I've received on the staff augmentation side and apply it to services? Can I work with organizations that are MSP in nature and ensure that compliance is followed and ensure that the work is being performed in the right locations and things of that nature? Because when you think about it, a lot of organizations are offshoring work. They're completely outsourcing services. And if a negative event were to occur, they can't stand behind the guise of, I had another company performing that service. Their brand is the one that's ultimately going to suffer. And so it's really important that they have an understanding of what's occurring and get under the hood and find out who's involved, where are they at, and what are the skill sets, and do I have candidate fraud, and all of those things. And so as a result, it becomes a starting point of pulling it in to your overall contingent program and your overall holistic conversation around talent management.
Yeah. And I'll just add, because I really like what you said there, Marie, and I completely agree. One way to look at it, back to your question, Bill, how do you start, or where do you begin with this? Measurement. So as Marie is talking there, starts with measurement, and by getting measurement around it, that gives control, and from control we can drive process improvement, and that's really what it's all about: is driving better outcomes for the business, better by optimization.
Maybe a simple question, but what are you measuring? What's the most effective things to measure at the beginning so you can start to measure against that as success criteria?
Yeah, there's we use this all the time at Guidant Global, but I think that we would share this with our industry colleagues. There's 4 main dimensions that we're measuring against. Quality, so we think about the deliverables. Are they being executed within the parameters? Do they meet the conditions of satisfaction? We think about efficiency and effectiveness. So the time, is it on-time delivery? Are there delays in that or change orders associated with it? Cost, we're not going to get away from it, but cost effectiveness specifically, to ensure that the commercials are reasonable and market-based, and that the value is equal to or greater than the the direct price being charged, and then compliance, risk management. So there's multiple measures within those, but those are the big four dimensions, and we can really drill down at a granular level there to understand what's transacting well, and where are there opportunities for improvement.
Okay. And Marie, you talked a little bit about stakeholders and the different stakeholders that you'd work with, and kind of transitioning from a contingent workforce program over into an SOW and a services procurement program, for example. With contingent workforce, it's often easier for procurement to identify the stakeholder. Stakeholder may be, while I know a lot of times there is no stakeholder because there's many and there's no one managing the whole pie, where there is somebody managing the whole pie, if it's not procurement, it's often HR. But when you broaden that to a much broader range of services, I wonder, like, who are the people in the organization that procurement can be engaging with to even be selling the idea of going beyond contingent workforce into managing services more holistically?
Often risk. They're going to be your huge ally around it. Finance teams are going to be critical, as well as your business. I think that we can't get away from the fact that a lot of organizations today still have their business writing and drafting the SOWs themselves. And procurement would love to, make them aware of the services that they even offer and how they can assist and protect the organization. And so, by going out and selling, the fact that MSPs as well as procurement can help them ensure that the right controls are in place, the scope of work is embedded in a contract in the right way, and so that they have recourse when things go south. And I think that it's more or less just communicating to everyone that you don't have to do it alone. There's truly a village surrounding you that's there to help and to make it a better experience for everyone involved.
Now, Kelly, I'm going to come over to you in a couple of minutes. I've got a couple more questions I want to pose, but anybody who's listening to this conversation as well, please feel free to just pop in any comments. I see that some comments have been coming in, but also ask some questions, and we'll do our best to pose those to Brian and Marie as time allows as well. Now, one of the questions that I wanted to pose, Brian, you touched on change management and the importance of change management. I just wonder if you could share a little bit more and kind of expand upon what kind of change management considerations should we be aware of really before starting a services procurement program as a procurement leader?
Sure. When we think about it from a project perspective, and this is a big cliche, but we prepare for the change, we manage the change, and we reinforce the change. And it becomes a virtuous cycle when we do that. So how do we do so? It does go back to the earlier comment in terms of understanding the voice of the customer. What are their current pain points with the existing process? Or is there an existing process? And is that the pain point in and of itself? What would be important to them? What constitutes a better outcome? Those varying stakeholder expectations, again, we keep referring back to, understanding what those are and what conditions of satisfaction are, what does or what would good look like. So once we have a good view, it doesn't have to be a complete view. These processes are iterative. No program stays static. They as the business grows, as the market shifts, they have to ebb and flow with that as well. So what we're looking to do is get a starting point here that we're building to and then reinforcing in that change process. So once we understand that, it's a matter of today process, future state process, opportunities for enhancement, why we're doing this. That's really important. Not just what we're doing, how we're doing it, and the reasons why we're doing it. And ultimately, it's the what's in it for me. How is this going to benefit them? What will their lives look like tomorrow that are better than they are today? At which point, though, I do want to say, if we stop there, we're missing something. We're spending a lot of time getting that voice of customer up front. If we're not coming back to understand, have we met those expectations, right? Have their conditions of satisfaction been executed against? We're missing a trick. So the change management's a constant, but it requires the right diligence to make sure that we're seeking to understand before, during, and after.
And I just want to ask a follow-up then. How are we kind of measuring the changing voice of the customer, or not just at a point in time, but over the duration of a engagement? Is that through governance? Is that through like an NPS program? What do you see some of the most effective ways to make sure that you're continuing to be on track with the program, as opposed to it, launching and then kind of forgetting?
Yeah. And you did say you'd be coming back to governance. So that is part of it. And as I think about it, there are those organizational or enterprise stakeholders that are part of a governance team, and they may have different expectations or outcomes than the ultimate requester. And so having that voice and having a cadence, I recommend minimum quarterly, executive engagement, minimum annually as part of this design. That should be part of the voice to make sure that we're executing against total organizational expectations. From a voice of customer, you mentioned NPS. I'm a big fan of Net Promoter Score. The scoring's helpful. The comments are gold. Yeah. Really key. And although I want a Net Promoter Score, I also want to drill down into the specifics underneath as well to better understand at a service level what's working or not working and can be improved upon. So I think surveying is really important. We leverage the automated tools, but you can't replicate a good conversation with that. And we always find that there is an outsized amount of buying from a small minority of the requester population. And so engaging directly with those power users can really help inform the shape and strategy with which we execute our program.
I just want to, one more shout out for Net Promoter Score and those comments being gold. We find the same. We do NPS across our community fairly often as well. And sometimes you look at those comments and, it's really great feedback. And sometimes you look at the comments and say, that's kind of how the program's designed to be. And so, then that's a different conversation versus, expectations versus, disappointments, if you will. But love the comments probably as much as the score itself.
Very much so.
Now, I do have one more question, Marie, for you, and this is around benchmarking. So as an organization is starting to go down this journey of looking at services procurement more holistically, what kind of benchmarking effort or initial intelligence gathering do you recommend? Is there kind of the initial opportunity analysis of whether this is something that it really makes sense to invest further in?
Definitely think that they should pay attention to their spend coming through this category. And do an assessment on readiness within their organization as well. One of the key buying signs, in my view, is around the education level of the hiring managers. Do they fully understand what path to talent is appropriate based off of some of the behavioral components needed within the relationship? And if the answer is no, then it's a clear sign that as an organization, we need to do something to pull in all paths to talent so that we can start the education journey, but also add in some of those protection areas as well around compliance, as well as overall spend. And when I think about the benchmarks and how do they determine what is needed, it's around efficiency, what's taking place within the program today, what's broken. How long does it take to successfully onboard a supplier? Could we do it a better, smarter way? And also, what's the satisfaction level? Through the voice of the customer, you're going to hear anecdotal information coming from your hiring managers around how things are perceived within the organization right now and how in touch you are with their business needs, and do we need to make a change? Once you get the program stood up, we talked about some of the analytics earlier that are needed to monitor ongoing success. Are you achieving your milestones, deliverables in the anticipated times that were originally allotted within the contract itself? One area that's often missed in a lot of contracts, we speak about key personnel, resources that are supposed to be dedicated to the service. How often are those resources actually remaining? And is that a missed opportunity for the organization to get rebates back because the suppliers failed to deliver as planned? Also, again, are the contracts taking longer than what it was originally anticipated? And that's an opportunity for procurement to dig in and learn what's going on. Was there a potential expansion in the service, which means that there needs to be an additional contract, an amendment of some sort where the scope of work changed? Or is it a supplier performance issue that we need to address and have conversations around? And so, I think that there's a lot that can be done around this program, from on initial benchmarking, but then also long-term analytics. And Brian, I think you wanted to add.
Yeah, I was just gonna. I'm thinking about our audience here as you're talking, and I'm nodding my head, but just very practically, right? For those who want to go down this path, where can they benchmark from? There's a lot of good sources out there. So there are research organizations like a staffing industry analysts that have a lot of good benchmarks and intelligence that's available. There's analytics tools that can help with benchmarking that we use, but could also be available directly as well. I'm a big fan of TDX, if you're familiar with it. They can offer a lot in this space. And then a shameless plug, but the right partner, the right provider can work with you to better understand how you compare. Are you top quartile performer? Are you a laggard? And are there opportunities to move those forward?
No, I promise this is my last follow-up question before I defer to Kelly, but how important is, and Brian, I'll ask this to you, how important is the profitability of your suppliers and not squeezing them for every single penny or every single cent as you're looking at a program like this? Because ultimately they need to be motivated to be able to support you as well.
Yeah, so assurance of supply is always a critical component, right? So if we have the best price, but no execution, and no partners who will do it, we haven't really accomplished anything. And the question is really timely because this dynamic has become more acute over the last 2 years when we talk about talent scarcity in the marketplace, and any service provider providing straight services, contingent workers, et cetera, was pinched on talent. And so ensuring that it is a partnership and that there's the right balance between commercials for both parties is really important. When everyone's looking for your product, you have to be offering a competitive price. It's Econ 101. Otherwise, the supply is going to go elsewhere. So it's something that I'm a big believer in. It does require balance, and that's why those benchmarking tools can be really helpful to understand, because you need to pay a fair price. I think we all agree to that. We need to ensure that the suppliers are sustainable, that we have assurance of supply. But no one wants to be on the other end and being charged an excessive rate and know that they're padding their profit or margin at my company expense. And so that's the delicate balance, and it's an important consideration for any program.
Thanks, Brian. Kelly, I'm going to hand over finally to you.
Thanks. I've been very patiently waiting, although it's been a very interesting conversation to wait through. One of the things that I understand, Brian, is that in order to help illustrate so many of the things that we've touched upon and how they work out in practice, you actually sort of have a live case example that you are going to share with us. Can I have you sort of walk us through some of the details of that, and then we can tie it back to some of the other things that we've touched upon?
Yeah, absolutely, because it brings it to life. So to talk about concept is one thing, to put it into action is another. And one example, and there's many, is a large financial services customer that we work with. In fact, they would have loved to have been here on this today with AOP, but for a heavy regulated industry, the idea of a live unscripted chat didn't meet their communications department standards. So we're going to do our best to speak for the voice of the customer. But it's an interesting journey because they started where so many others do, which is traditional temporary labor. And it was across a wide array of categories. So financial services firm, a lot in accounting and audit, general professional, some IT, call center, customer care and service. So a wide range of this. And their conditions of satisfaction, their objectives were very similar to things that we've talked about already. How do we ensure that we get the right talent in the door? How do we ensure that the commercials are well vetted and tested? Compliance, especially, as I said, heavy regulated environment, absolutely critical. Individuals have access to PII. Have they been vetted? Do we have the right contractual and personal protections in place to manage that? The right asset management so that the access, given that sensitivity, is turned on and off in the right times. So all of those things were really important. As we worked with them and we continue to develop and show promise and execution against those standards, I beg the question, what else are we missing? And I mentioned earlier that we often see services procurement statements of work, the spend be 2 to 3x. In this particular client, it was more like 5 to 6x. And in particular, they were doing a lot of their IT services purchasing on a statement of work. There's reasons for that. It made sense. But whereas we had a tight control environment on one side of the aisle, on the other side, it's not to say that they didn't have controls, but there was opportunity there to take some of those best benefits and offer the organization a holistic view. And so we started with, very similar to the earlier comments, measurement, putting the right controls in place. We leveraged a VMS or vendor management system in order to help manage a rec to check process, or an SOW to check process on that. And just to give a frame of reference here as we talk about scale, in the first 12 months, we're looking at just under 500 SOWs processed, in that with a spend commitment to it of just shy of 200 million. So meaningful dollars when we talk about impact to the organization. So with that measurement, with a better understanding, the next layer was, how do we offer greater support to the actual sourcing and contracting of that spend? What Marie just talked about. How do we ensure that that contract has the additional key personnel, the right indemnifications? Are they what are the service guarantees associated with it? Are there certain intellectual property they're bringing to the table to support this? A new IP, who's the owner of that? All of those things that are so important to anyone who's looked at a contract, make it the thoroughness, the rigors around that really important. So how do we bring it to that population? And so now when we look at this organization, in a click of a button, we can say, here's your external talent. Here's the totality of it. What's the right way? And this conversation wasn't taking place before. What's the right way to engage it? We've always done it on a statement of work, but should we be? Are we paying a premium for risk that the supplier is not taking because we're actually managing the work? Or does it make sense because we want to take that ownership, or we want the supplier to take that ownership? I said that backwards, and be accountable for a deliverable here that actually has greater efficiency and outcome benefit for the organization. So these types of conversations are now daily there, and we have the ability, because we sit at the point of purchase, to instruct, inform, and optimize. And it's been a really exciting journey, and it continues. Simply put, this isn't the stopping point. This is one step on a many-year and many-fold step to comprehensive talent procurement.
Marie, I want to pull you in for a second and ask you about something I heard Brian say that I think is incredibly important, actually, for all procurement activity, not just within services. He was talking about this organization looking at the work that they had been doing around contingent workforce and asking themselves, is there something that we're missing here? I think when you're trying to improve anything, it's one thing to look at what you've done or something you know that you need that you don't have. It takes a next level of strategy and awareness and vision to stop and say, okay, what are we not asking? What are we not thinking to pull in? Is that type of magical moment something that is common as companies go down this journey? Is it very unique? Is it something that you get the opportunity at times to help be a part of that discussion, to help maybe work with companies to actually enlarge the circle of their vision around contingent workforce and services procurement?
Yes. I think that with all of the programs that the folks that are listening in might be managing today, always think about the fact that there's always a next. We should always be moving the needle with respect to our programs. And we should be challenging ourselves to identify how can we have a greater influence, and quite frankly, not be afraid to lose an element of control. I know that when I talk to a lot of procurement organizations, there's often a fear factor with relinquishing some control related to statement of work. Am I going to have to lose resources internally, or are we going to lose influence over our organization? The reality is that there's always something additional to do for the company and to help the company become greater and more powerful within their space. And so I think that, for anyone listening, I would say, don't hold back based off of what you control today. Recognize that you have tremendous influence within your organization, and it is important to think about that next. And that next will often be incorporating statement of work. That next could include thinking about what's taking place on the global front. We are a part of large organizations, and it's our role to constantly determine how can we influence and how can we become better. There's always work to be done. Don't be comfortable with the status quo. Always think about, what the next evolution within the program is. And quite frankly, expect your MSP partners to push you in that direction as well. We shouldn't, as an MSP provider, be comfortable just with the current state. We need to recognize that our success, our level of customer satisfaction with the customer is based off of what we're going to be doing 5 years down the road, not what we're doing today. So we should always be focused on the next phase in our journey.
And
Go
Maria,
ahead, Brian.
Just as it relates to this specific case study, I'm going to play off of that because I think there's a great example here in as you talk about not being afraid to relinquish. And the fact is, if we give up some things that can allow us to focus on a greater priority. And in this particular example, we talk about that strategic sourcing work and managing the source to contract aspect. The customer, and this is a credit to them, made a very specific decision, which is we recognize that not all purchases are equal, not all have the same impact. We want to leverage a partner and a program to handle this, what I'm going to call very long tail. But there are certain engagements that are critical to the organization. They're strategic and the C-level. We want to manage those. We still want the tracking and the visibility, et cetera. So we're going to leverage the technology and support there, but the sourcing of it and the management of it, we're going to hold that ourselves. So it's by design a bifurcation, but it's a very deliberate bifurcation, recognizing that they can drive more value by leaning in on those high dollar value statements of work and deliver excellence for the business, leveraging a program and a partner for the rest.
Well, Brian, let's stay with that idea of value for a minute, because Marie mentioned influence. And certainly we know that a well-managed talent program can bring cost efficiency, can improve execution, right? Can minimize risk. But if we're selfish for a minute, procurement's involvement in an effective talent management program also has secondary benefits for procurement in terms of internal influence and opportunity. Can you speak, whether within the context of this case example or even a little bit more generally, what are some of the secondary opportunities or benefits that come back to procurement when they're able to take contingent workforce services procurement to the next level for the company as a whole?
Yeah. So I do think it's that I love where you're going with this, and I absolutely believe it to be true. So I always think about the holy grail is getting in front of demand versus papering demand or processing demand and on the back end. And so what you're describing right there is exactly that opportunity to be in the planning suite with the business executives to help them not process what they already decide to do, but educate, inform. So it's the elevation of procurement as a strategic partner to the business, not a corporate back office function, but literally a strategic business partner, and engaging with the business in their budgets, in their forecast, as they plan product, as they plan service launches. It's a whole different dynamic, and that's earned. It's earned through execution and trust.
Now, as we start to wrap our time down, one thing I'd like to have an opportunity to get from each of you, and Brian, I can start with you around this. We've gone through some general topics and concerns and opportunities. You walked us through that case study and some of the things that you learned there and how things played out. But if we start to think about general lessons learned and best practices, if we want the people that have joined us live today or listening in later on to walk away with, we like to think of them as opportunities to take action, what are maybe some good actionable tips or pieces of advice that you would offer up to companies that are either starting to mature the way that they manage contingent workforce, starting to manage the way they mature services procurement, or even potentially at that point where they're saying, what opportunity are we missing to combine these two? What advice would you offer up either around actions or internal conversations?
That's a really good question, and it's not a singular answer. The first thing that I would encourage is take the right time to prepare. And preparation, a little extra time on the front end can generate significant benefits on the back. So that preparation comes in many forms. It is absolutely understanding the data. Where does it lie? Where are we buying? Where does it lie right now? And it's typically not just in a single system. There's a number of places you can go to get this information and better understand throughput. Understanding the requesters, the service users, the consumers, whom they are, and engaging on the front end those hiring managers or requesters to get a look behind the scenes. And I recommend getting the right executive sponsorship. We talked about change. We talked about governance. So if this is something that you want to tackle, it is not a lone wolf type project. You're going to need the support of the business. So having the right partner, the right shepherd in the organization can make a really meaningful difference. The second, so as I said, there's a lot here. I'll stop at 2, and we'll give Marie an opportunity to add on. But I would say, don't be afraid to fail. And what I mean by that is no one wants to launch a failed program, but we are touching every aspect of the business. We have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of external contractors that can be in the scope of the program. Not everything will go perfect. And in fact, that's okay, because that's what we build upon to improve. That's where we take you mentioned lessons learned. It's a critical part of this. So if we understand where things are deviating compared to our expectation, we drill down into the root cause, we end up with a better program over time that's consistently improving. So perfection's not the goal. It's ongoing, meaningful improvement.
One quick follow-up question for you, and then Marie, I'll come to you for best practices and advice. You talked about executive sponsorship, executive involvement, and then you talk about not being afraid to fail and all of the different functions within the company that could potentially be affected if something goes wrong. To what extent should procurement be looking to build out some level of cross-functional executive sponsorship so that if, and let's just say when, something goes wrong, it's not strictly a procurement executive sponsor or even a finance executive sponsor, but maybe a couple of somebodies that are closer to where something may have gone wrong, so that at least there's some basic understanding of the background effort and the rigor in place when people are having their initial response to maybe an unexpected set of events.
Yeah. Another great call out, Kelly. I appreciate it. So you almost answered it in your question, right? In that the answer is that governance should be cross-functional. The natural partner here, and it doesn't matter who's the lead, the natural partner on this is human resources and talent acquisition, because we are talking about external talent, and we are making a purchase, right? We're buying that service. We're buying the provision of contract labor from a supplier, and it has to be papered, and it has to be procured, and it has to be managed. But there are unique elements of that, because as a person, what is an obligation as a joint employer? Do they feed into our full-time talent funnel? It is a very natural combination. And so I would say start there without question. And then to the extent that you can bring in, typically procurement will roll into the financial organization. We get the right financial sponsorship. Marie mentioned earlier, risk, getting legal involved, IT, security. There's a lot of potential partners here that stand to benefit and would be happy to add their name onto a success. I would say your natural starting partner is your talent acquisition or HR organization.
So, Phil, I promise we'll save time for your final thoughts and then you can take us to wrap. But before we do that, Marie, I want to hear from you thoughts around best practices, advice, action-based tips. If people are just leaving our conversation and their minds are full of all of the things that you and Brian shared today, what are maybe a couple of points that you would really want them to walk away being focused on?
Definitely ensure that your program is based around those 4 pillars of success, right? Do we know what quality looks like for the organization? How are we going to determine whether or not we have high quality suppliers, high quality talent, high quality MSP providers, et cetera? Do we have efficiency in the way that we're managing our relationships with third-party vendors? How do we ensure that proper financial approvals are in place? If there are significant changes to scope, which might place the organization at risk, do we have those stakeholders inserted in order to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to chime in and ensure that it's right for the organization? Compliance, we definitely drove home that point. That is something that's going to be key in ensuring that your program is solid. What audit practices are in place to make sure that the suppliers are doing the right things. They're onboarding people in accordance with your guidelines for the type of services. And the cost, you can't ignore that. How much are you spending today? And do you know why you're spending those volumes? If the answer to that is no, then there's really a need to get more transparency into the granular aspects so that you can determine whether or not you have a solid program around statement of work and services procurement.
So really where we need to be focused is not necessarily where services and contingent workforce are so incredibly unique from products, but truthfully in the ways that they're similar, right? You said baseline. We talked about visibility. We talked about cross-functional sponsorship and relationships both inside and outside of the organization. I do think, I'm biased, there's a bigger opportunity for procurement around this, right? Because it's a more personal level of effort and a more personal level of return. But I think that's great advice that both you and Brian were able to share. Phil, did you have any final wrapping thoughts that you wanted to share?
Yeah, and as always, this is a conversation where we could ask so many more questions and go way over the time that we have allocated. I have one really quick fire question, Brian. I'll just pose this to you. We talked about getting set up in a program, about delivering the first kind of program and everything that goes into thinking of that. I just have a question which comes back to governance at the end, but for organizations that have matured their program, what kind of signs or information or data or metrics, and this may be things we've already talked about before, should an organization that has a more mature program already in place be looking at to figure out if it's fit for purpose first and foremost, but where can we continue with improvement?
Wow, that is actually not a quick answer type question, but the premise that you're stating is 100% true. There is a maturity matrix, and it's something we have a maturity matrix. There are also general ones out there, and you look at the different dimensions of program execution. And I'm not just referring to the measurement areas like quality, efficiency. I'm talking about sustainability. I'm talking about governance and others. And there is a natural evolution. So from decentralized to centralized, controlled, to one part of the business to enterprise locations, etc. So, so loaded question, but it is something that a well-governed program, internal, external, should have a line of sight in terms of how that evolution should progress over time. And we use the terminology all the time. It fits. A generation 1 program, a generation 2, a generation 3. It doesn't matter where you start, it's where you're going to.
Yeah, don't set and forget. And as Marie said earlier, always looking at what's next. Well, I know it's come to time for today's conversation. So I want to first of all thank everybody for joining us, for listening in. We really appreciate you joining us in this AOP Live. For Kelly, of course, for helping facilitate the conversation. And Brian and Marie, I want to thank you so much for you joining us and for all your insights and expertise that you shared with our community today.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you both for having us.
All right.
Thanks very much,
everybody. Bye.